When you're leading huge transformation across an entire business, perhaps your biggest challenge isn't actually strategic, but internal, your own self-doubt that can get in the way. In this episode, I speak with Mike Ettling, who recently stepped down as CEO of Unit4 after a transformative 6-year tenure where he led the company through a business model change, from taking it from on-premise software provider to a unified cloud-first organization. He navigated culture shifts, navigated the demands of investors, and he also worked on his own self-doubt and inner game, all the things that hold us back when we're playing at a high level. So we get into exactly this story in today's episode. We look at why hiring for hardship and failures is much better than hiring based on all the usual things that we look for on a resume. We look at what really breaks a transformation. We look at how you get speed, momentum, culture, purpose in a private equity environment. And we look at how to manage self-doubt when you're surrounded with brilliant people. So enjoy this conversation, hard-won truths on leading transformation from Mike Ettling. Welcome to the Impact Multiplier CEO podcast. I'm Richard Medcalf, founder of X Quadrant, and my mission is to help the world's top CEOs and entrepreneurs shift from incremental to exponential progress and create a huge positive impact on our world. Now, that requires you to reinvent yourself and transform your business. So, if you're ready to play a bigger game than ever before, I invite you to join us and become an Impact Multiplier CEO. Hi, Mike, and welcome to the show.
Hey, Richard. How are you?
I'm great, thank you. And it's a real pleasure to have you. Anybody who's seen Queen live in concert is good by me. So I know that's one of in your past. So, Mike, I know that you've just handed the reins over as CEO of Unit4 after, I think, 6 years in tenure, where you transformed it from a legacy on-premise software business into a pure cloud player very successfully. And so I'd love us to kind of explore that and perhaps other parts of your leadership journey today. But let me start with this. One thing that you mentioned is that even when you're leading at that global scale, and perhaps we can kind of get into a bit about what the business, was and is and how you transformed it. But I think one of the key questions that I have is, you mentioned to me that despite leading that global business and seeing all this transformation, there were moments where you really had self-doubt at the top of that pyramid. So I'm kind of curious to hear the story of Unit4 and then to kind of dive into how it felt as you were leading that transformation.
Yeah. Well, firstly, it's great to be here. And unfortunately, my track record on seeing Queen was 5 minutes.
Okay.
Because Freddie Mercury had a voice problem. We won't discuss why. 5 minutes into the concert and abandoned the concert.
Well, it's 5 minutes more than me, so that does suck. So yeah.
Unit4 is an interesting story. It was a very challenged business, very multi-product business, very on-prem traditionally, culturally very much a federation of individual countries. And, we spent 6 years and it's very much transformed now into more of a singular product business, ERP for people businesses, very global and functional in how it runs. And all the metrics are very, almost best in class for a cloud kind of business. And that journey's been very, very interesting. And through that journey, also selling to a new owner, from one private equity fund to another private equity fund. So it's been a really interesting journey. When you think about your comment about leading in a global context, I've always, ever since leaving South Africa in 1997, I've always been called to run global or multi-country businesses. I've lived in different countries, but no one ever called me to run something in the UK or to run something in the USA. They always called me to run something global or something across Europe. Maybe it's the chameleon nature of us South Africans. But I also think there's a very strong element around when you leave your home country, and you're forced to, because our sandbox is quite small in South Africa, all the things which you would normally do in assembling talent go out the window. because, you know, you land in London and yeah, maybe you've heard of Cambridge and Oxford, but you got no clue whether Hull is better than Manchester or Southampton is, you know, better than Liverpool University. So you got to learn, you can't pigeonhole. Your whole pigeonholing ability is removed. So you really got to learn to interview and recruit talent based on talent, you know, based on capability, you know, because the CV is way worth less to you as a leader. And I think that's one of the things which changes when you go and work globally very early in your career, and then it stays with you. You know, you constantly evaluate talent on that basis. You constantly place less value. I think I place less value on the CV and the academic background than many other leaders do, because I'm looking more at the sort of cultural background and the upbringing and the experiences and sort of the hardship and dynamics.
Well, let's focus right on that for a second, because it is a key issue, right? Hiring is such a key issue for every executive. So, yeah, if in the absence of those kind of cultural markers of, you know, prestige, like in an interview setting, what do you look for? Like, you talk about these kind of cultural markers, but like concretely, how are you going to distinguish a mediocre player from somebody that you really, really want to hire?
So there's a couple things, and then there's a question I always get into. So generically, I'm looking for the ability to have overcome and dealt with hardship in their background, whether it's at a personal level, whether it's at a cultural level. You know, I was interviewing an exec once, and he was talking about how he lived through the Angolan Civil War. It's a Portuguese exec with his parents, and, you know, they were destitute through that process, came back to Portugal and almost started from scratch. You know, and to me, that is like an incredibly strong signal of the ability to deal with hardship and, you know, not get taken down by it. So that's one thing I'm always looking for, is where are those great sort of hardship stories? And they don't have to be hardship. They just need to also be sort of down to earth stories. Like, you know, the person spent a lot of time growing up on a farm. People have very different kind of views of you know, getting from A to B in life with that sort of background. And then the topic I always get into is, let's talk about your failures in life and what did you learn from your failures? And that question always stuns me when I get into the discussion. People still, even in today, will turn around and say they haven't had any failures. And to me, that's another really strong signal. Can someone talk about challenges they had? Have they internalized it? Can they articulate it? And can they articulate what were, you know, the learnings in that process? And how has that changed them as a leader in their world?
Yeah, of course, I'm going to have to ask you now, Mike, you know, what's the failure that you've had, and how's it changed your leadership? I've got to ask the man.
Yeah, I think, you know, I recall in the early days of my leadership, I was probably too influenced by leadership books and too influenced by, you know, process of leadership. Until a boss, a mentor actually said to me, "Who the hell are you? What makes Mike tick? You know, what is you?" And we kind of talked about this, and I enjoy the bush, and I enjoy barbecues, or braais as we call it, and rugby. And he said, "Well, do that with your team. Become you with your team." So there was a strong lesson there around, you know, leadership is about being authentic, not about following processes and methodologies. And I've actually become quite a cynic on leadership textbooks. I always say, my people always know, I say there's only one book I recommend. Everything else is, you know, not really worth reading. And so that's the one kind of dynamic which I think is really important. And then I was fortunate very early in my career back in South Africa. I started 2 businesses, and one was wildly successful and one was a failure. And the one that was a failure because of stakeholder management. You know, it had multiple stakeholders, you know, public company, individuals, and the stakeholder management. I was a young entrepreneur. I was focused on building the business. I wasn't thinking about stakeholder management. And that business, I think, would have been successful had I been able to do the stakeholder management more effectively.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I was working with a while back. I was working with the leadership team in a pharma company, and the general manager and her reports. And it's really interesting because this hotshot new person came in, and quite young, but very accomplished, and had a big remit. And we had some sessions together, and I was working with her, and I think she kind of went off the radar, disappeared for a while, and eventually kind of we managed to catch up. And I said, "Oh, it's been a while. How's it going?" And she's like, "Oh, super busy, crazy busy, as I expected." And I could tell she was speaking fast. She was like in that superhero mode, I call it, trying to prove herself, to the boss and everything, and show all the things she could do. I kind of eventually slowed it down a little bit and said, "Okay, so just like, why were you hired? Like, what are the big goals and so forth?" And in the conversation, she suddenly went, "Oh my word! Like, I've been doing this one. We had two main things I was there to have been hired to do, and I'm only doing one of them because it was the one which is like the easiest, the most like it's the most in my comfort zone, the one that I've done in the past, and I'm like massively over delivering on that one. This other part, I'm just not even getting to." And then I also said, like, "Okay, and how's the relationship with the general manager?" And she was like, "Oh, heck, I barely speak to the general manager, like her boss, because I'm so busy running around this large company, networking, making an impact and so forth," that she was like losing sync with her number one stakeholder. So it's a different situation. I've got examples from CEOs as well, but this one just comes to mind because it can be so easy, as you say, when you're like focused on some short-term deliverables, not see the big context shift.
Yeah, and I think I was very grateful it happened so early in my career. And I think it's easy to happen when you're an early stage entrepreneur. And it's been something which has been very key, I think, to success thereafter.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that the moments, back to your point about failure being learning, there was a time in my very early career where I took on too many projects at once. It was like a moment where I was up for a promotion. And I wanted to show what an amazing project manager I was, which is going to take me to the next level. I ended up taking on 3 really, really interesting projects that all happened to come up the same. They were meant to be staggered. In the end, they all got sold like at the same date. And of course, I did an okay job on all of them. But if I had just done one of them and nailed it, it would have been much better. It would have been much better, and I'd have got that promotion a bit faster. So, but believe me, at least I don't make that mistake twice. You learn it once, and then suddenly you realize, oh, it's not about the quantity. It really is not about the quantity.
Totally agree with that. It's all about the quality and the quality of the engagement and experience.
Yeah, so there you go. So that was where I was permanently shift. Like, better to nail one thing than to like do an okay job at 3 things. Anyway, so let's kind of go back to, we'll kind of go back a little bit. So what I hear in terms of hiring, looking less at all the certificates and accolades, looking around hardship and failure as the kind of way to really understand where somebody's coming from. Is there anything else you want to say on that, or should we move back onto the story of Unit?
No, I think hardship, failure, and then I think the other aspect which is really important is trying to get to the bottom of understanding how the person will behave in a team dynamic. I think this is really, really an important concept, which is often hard to do in business. Sports coaches spend a lot of time thinking about, if I bring in this fly off or this scrum off, how do they play together and what's the team dynamic? We tend to focus a bit more on individual capability. And I would say all the times where I've had a hire I regret, it's all been because I haven't put enough effort up front trying to figure out how does this person going to play on the team.
Yeah. So how do you do that? How do you try to discern that in a session?
I think 2 things. I just use 2 very simple techniques. One is have the whole team meet them. particularly at a senior, if you're dealing with the exco or senior team of a company. And two, find, and there's lots of these out there, find some form of assessment. And it's not about, is there a perfect assessment, but it's more about putting everyone on your team through the same assessment. So you really can, have a common standard to look at how they balance each other. And then consistently doing that when you're bringing people into the team. So you've got that kind of view, a little bit more theoretically, over how is this person going to play on the team in a team dynamic.
Yeah, having that common language. Yeah.
Yeah. And, whenever I've kind of compromised on that or not done it thoroughly enough, I end up in a regret hire situation.
Yeah, fascinating. Made me think of an executive team I worked with a while back. And there was an amalgamation of three different companies, basically. There was like a merger, and then there was private equity people who had also inserted a couple of their people. And I'll tell you what, I did one of these assessments, and you didn't have to tell me the three groupings. It was immediately obvious that the private equity people had put in a very certain sort of person. The original company had a very certain sort of person, and the new CEO and some of his team, very specific profile, and they were very different. And so no wonder there was a bit of a cultural friction because people often recruit very similar people if they're not aware.
Well, and I always use the rugby or sports analogy. It's easy to see it post the event. 6 months into the person's hire, you could walk into the company and you're spotted straight away. You won't even have to do an assessment or any sort of process. But unlike, sport, where you can go watch the player play at a local level or a local club level, and you can kind of see the interaction, and that's essentially what you're trying to emulate with some sort of evaluation skill, because you can't really see that in business when you're hiring someone onto the team. And trying to get that view, I think, is really key. And then letting your team engage in the recruiting process as well, which often is complex because you're doing confidential hiring or something. But at some point, I think it's really important to let the whole team engage with the individual, before you sign on the dotted line.
Perfect. Okay, so let's kind of go back to this journey of Unit4, because you obviously had to lead this big transformation to shift this on-premises business to the cloud, and to go through the whole business model challenge that goes from charging upfront fees to recurring subscriptions and all the rest of it. And sounds like that went really well. However, talk to me about, again, this question of self-doubt that we started the conversation with a little bit. How did that show up? Was there a difference in, were there triggers when that would come in? Were there kind of particularly difficult moments? Just kind of wondering, because I think it's something which a lot of my clients, a lot of leaders do struggle with, and they wrestle with, and they have this imposter syndrome. So curious to hear your side on this.
Yeah, I think there's different dimensions to this. I think there's kind of macroeconomic shifts, and there's kind of leadership dynamics. And I think in the leadership dynamic piece, the whole thing around, I'm a strong believer in hiring really, really smart people. Really smart people are going to challenge you all the time. So you better have your self-doubt under control if you believe in that concept, because there's always going to be smarter people. By definition, the private equity model is always going to do that as well. So, if you're a CEO of a style of, I know it all, I'm the king of the castle kind of approach, you're not going to succeed in private equity. Because by definition, the private equity model is bringing, lots of pattern recognition, lots of smart people around the table, lots of experience in other companies to bear to help you get from A to B faster. And I've often seen CEOs struggle in private equity because there's, CEOs, sometimes we have this mindset that we need to have the answer to everything. And you don't. You absolutely don't. And you can't, because if you take that approach, within 2 months of being owned by a private equity fund, you're going to think you're the biggest idiot on the planet. But that's the value they bring. And your job as the CEO is to figure out how to bring all that value, what to use, what not to use, and how to short circuit the journey you need to take the company on. So I think that's, a really important thing about, managing self-doubt and not letting it manifest itself as a leader is to make sure you can embrace all the smartness around you and accept the fact that you're not the smartest kid on the block.
Well, there's a paradox here, I think, right? There's a paradox in what you're saying, because on one hand, you could say, well, if you didn't have any self-doubt, right, then you would feel you did have the answer to everything and you're not going to be open to the input from other people, right? On the other hand, if you're crippled by self-doubt, right, then you're not going to be the leader that people need either. So I think there's something here about, having the kind of inner confidence that you don't need to have all the answers, but well, to use a sporting analogy, I actually use it often with my clients. It's like you're wearing the jersey, like you that is your role. You don't have to go around proving it to yourself or to other people, and you're actually therefore free just to focus on what needs to be done.
And I totally agree with that thing that, the self-doubt and confidence can coexist. They're not opposites. So you can see very confident leaders build a lot of self-doubt. And I think your point about just having that inner calmness, that inner confidence, you're wearing the jersey, I'm the number 15, I'm wearing the jersey, I know what I got to do, is, so important. There, in the last Rugby World Cup, there was that South African kicker who had Pollard, who had to kick from the halfway line to win the game. I think it was against England. And Bongi just handed him the ball and said, "For South Africa." When made the decision to kick for goals, that's a classic self-doubt problem. He could have enormous self-doubt, but he didn't. He just had that calm inner confidence and kicked it over and won the game. So I think that's a really important dynamic is, you got to have that inner confidence. And it's not about being arrogant and overconfident, but it's about, I think your description of you're comfortable in the jersey.
I hope you're enjoying this conversation. This is just a quick interlude to introduce you to two transformative programs that we run. The first is Rivendell, my exclusive group of top CEOs who are committed to transforming themselves, their businesses, and the world. It's an incredible peer group and a deep coaching experience that will push you to new heights, no matter how successful you've already been. The second is Impact Accelerator, a coaching program for executives who are ready to make a big leap forward in their own leadership. It's regularly described as life-changing, and no other program provides such personal, strategic clarity, a measurable shift in stakeholder perceptions, and a world-class leadership development environment. Find out about both of these programs at xquadrant.com/services. Now, back to the conversation. And so when you were going through that transition yourself and you had smart people around, did you find yourself, veering at some point, too much into one of these areas, overconfidence, too much self-doubt, just how did you?
Yeah, I think I tend to, I'm a glass half full person. So I tend to see the positive in everything. I work well when I've got a close team, a CFO or a COO on the team who's a little bit more glass half empty, because it creates a good balance. But also, when you have really, really smart people around, it's very easy to start saying, well, what value am I adding? Surely I should be bringing that knowledge to the table. And you've got to constantly remind yourself, no, your value is to lead this and to synthesize it all and, create the result of the game, not to have the individual skills to make it happen.
And so let's talk about that as as you're running this transition, this transformation of the business. I know that you had a global team across many continents or many countries. How did you kind of go about actually moving from A to B, and bringing the organization with you, right? Because obviously, I guess there's quite a big change process. Some roles are going to change or disappear. The pricing model is going to change. Business model is going to change. Distribution might change. I mean, there's a whole lot of things that can change with a lot of probably creates a lot of nervousness in people or uncertainty. And you've got the different cultural dimensions. So kind of what's your playbook for navigating through that?
Yeah, when I started the journey, I remember using this expression that, Unit4 is a cloud, sort of got a cloud software product, so masquerading as a cloud company, but behaving like an on-premise company. And the goal is to behave as a cloud company. So the product side is often the easiest thing to do, is to move the product to on-premise, from on-premise to cloud. The real challenge is to change the behavior, and the behaviors are fundamentally different. And the behavior, I think, comes down to this fundamental principle that in on-premise software, we used to build software, sell software, support software, and often it became somebody else's problem to make the software work, an integrator or an SI. In the cloud world, everything's far more integrated. And the customer comes back to you if it's not working. They don't go to the integrator the way they used to go in the on-prem world. It's my problem when it doesn't work. So there's a fundamentally different cultural behavior around how we sell, what's in the terms, what's in the contract, the language we use with customers, So you often see, and we went through this transformation where you get the product right, you get your sales contracts right, and then you're still having customers struggling. And then you realize, well, your implementation people are still arriving at the customer and saying, what do you want? Which is the on-premise way, versus arriving and saying, this is what you're going to get. How do we help adapt your processes to this best practice model? Or here's 2 best practice models. Which one do you want? So that's very different culturally. And, it's very hard in the SI world. I previously was CEO of an SI business who specialized first in on-premise and then cloud software. When SI people have been heroes for 30 years by asking a customer, what do you want? And then going off and customizing exactly what they wanted, it's very hard to change that DNA and to change that culture. So, how do you do it exactly? Well, you got to do it with a combination of process, people, and constant selling. I call it selling the dream. So process, you got to put the right new processes in place which make it work. You got to bring people in and scatter people in the organization who were born in the cloud, who don't know another language, who only speak that language, because you put people with the right, enough foreign language in the organization, the old people pick up the new language. And then you got to really keep, selling the dream, keep talking the language, keep reminding people what it's about, keep reminding what we're doing. And that's how you transform it. And then it's really a question of, getting the choreography and timing right so you don't break the organization. And every organization is different.
Yeah, it's definitely a dance. I mean, what would you say is what was the trickiest part of that? Like, was there a particular mindset or particular part of the organization which was just really hard to shift, because of the latest?
I think our implementation business was the hardest to shift. We shifted the other stuff very quickly. In Unit4 was the implementation business, because we did have a very malleable product and we could customize. We had features in the product which enabled customization to the nth degree. So really changing that culture was quite challenging. And then I think the other thing which is hard to change, but a little bit more, you can do it a little bit more playbook driven, is changing the culture from being country centric to being a global, functionally run software business. Where country is yes, there's a country head, but they're down in the organization. They're not the sort of fiefdom of country presidents. And that, that took much longer than I thought. But when I look back on it, the thing I think which is the key, and my advice to people doing this transformation, is you have to transform your HR and finance function first. Because often what you find is that the country fiefdom power is driven by the fact that there's a financial director and an HR leader in that country, and they're keeping the moat up as to why you can't run things globally, you can't run it functionally, we got to do this in the country for HR, we got to close the books in the country. I'm transform that first, and then the rest actually is quite easy to do.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. I've seen that in a number of places, and you're right. There is the on-prem world did lead to a fiefdom of, country presidents. And I would have probably guessed the finance part, but I think HR as well is quite an interesting one. Was that because of how would HR kind of get in the way? I mean, finance obviously has got the access to the numbers and
the numbers. Well, HR, kind of has, we got to do this because this is what it's done. This is what happens in France. This is what happens. Yeah. Whereas what I found is often in HR, there's kind of like the norm and there's what's legislatively required. And often they're quite different. And often the norm is portrayed as all being legislatively required, and it's not. So, kind of driving HR process and philosophy. And, we did all of this transformation between 2019 and now, and our engagement scores went up 10 points, went from 70 to 80s while doing a significant amount of transformation. And I don't think we could have done that if we had HR operating independently in every single country.
Yeah, got it. Yeah, really, really helpful insight. So, Mike, as we kind of start to think about perhaps wrapping up, I have, I guess, a couple of quite final questions for you. One question is, what advice would you give a CEO, perhaps who's joined, who's taken on the reins at a private equity-owned company, has got a big challenge ahead of them? That's a scenario that you know well. Like, where would you where would you encourage them to put their focus as they kind of get into the role? And, any particular, you mentioned a couple already, but like any particular kind of missteps to avoid?
Yeah, I would say probably three areas. One is, every private equity firm underwrites a deal based on a value creation plan. So really understand the value creation plan, but not in the context of, I see often too many CEOs come in and say, right, we're going to sell the company for X billion in such a time. Well, no, you're not. You've got to build a great company, and then you'll have lots of options to sell it for something. But the conflict with that is that the PE guys have got a value creation plan when they've mapped out, the 5 things which have got to happen, and they'll get to this kind of model. So how do you internalize that value creation plan in the organization in a way that it's in the context of a sense of purpose, not a price tag on the business in 4 years' time? Because if you drive a value creation plan with a price tag concept, you're never going to get it. If you drive the value creation plan in the context of a sense of purpose, then you'll get it. So often what I see the struggle is CEOs come in, the business has had a sense of purpose, before when they're running it, and they've never thought, oh, hold on, we might have to realign or change the sense of purpose to kind of incorporate this. So that would be my first thing, is like, look at the sense of purpose. Don't change the values. The values are what made the company great, but look at what's the sense of purpose? How does the value creation plan play into that? How do you build that into a consistent story? The second thing is around talent. And this is the one book I do recommend to every leader. And it's Marshall Goldsmith's What's Got You Here Won't Get You There. Because I think that's the single fundamental thing which you got to get right, is what got the business to the sale is not what's going to get it to the next phase. If you look at the team which existed at Unit4 when we sold it from Advent to TA, there's only one person left on that team, including looking at me, because what, that because of that exact principle. And that's often tough for CEOs because they've got to a milestone where the business has been sold to PE or where everything and the team's been successful and it's a tight-knit team and there's a sense of camaraderie. But you've got to be able to step back and look quite clinically at, is this the right team now to deliver the value creation plan? And there's a difference between, is it a good team and is it the right team to deliver the value creation plan? So that's the second sort of piece of advice I would have. And then the third one is in this context of, self-doubt, lots of smart people, lots of MBAs at the table, lots of advisors all around, is the way you kind of herd all those cats is control the cadence. Don't give up control of the cadence. So, what are your calls with the PE firm? What's the board structure? What's the monthly meeting? Have a very well documented corporate calendar and corporate cadence with very clear things of what do you want to achieve in the different calls. So, for example, we have a monthly sponsor call, which lets the PE guys go crazy on the numbers, which means they don't have to do that in the board meeting. And the board meeting can focus more on strategic topics, and the non-execs can spend more time contributing in the board meeting. So getting the cadence right. So those three things would be my advice to any CEO stepping into their sort of first PE gig.
Yeah, beautiful advice. And so much in that actually, Mike. I think the point about purpose is really well made. I think too many CEOs end up just, as you say, they just become, I'm just a person hired to deliver a number rather than to build a great business, which requires actually embodying the requirements of the investors, but also everything else that makes a business important, right? Comment about the right team versus a good team. And then I think your point about the cadence, which for me is, I describe it as, there's structure and there's life, and you have to put in the right structure, like the trellis upon which the plant can grow and be supported. And, a stronger structure will enable a stronger plant or organism to grow in many ways. And I think, your comment about helping the numbers guys get happy outside of the board meetings is genius, right? Because otherwise, I know a lot of CEOs who've found that their board meetings are not always delivering what they really want, and they can be quite tedious for them, because probably, as we said, they're not necessarily getting those issues off the table to create space for the really important conversations they want to have.
I had this beautiful experience when I was down in the bush recently, and there's a territory which a particular male lion was controlling, and we found this lion really early morning, and it was out absolutely growling and marking its territory with its noise. And then it sort of went to the watering hole, and there were all these wildebeest or gnus, as they're called in English. And it was kind of herding these gnus. It didn't want to eat them, but it was like herding them to go, they're all running away so it could go to the watering hole. And I kind of thought of the PE analogy of like the lion being the CEO. You've got to manage all your stakeholders effectively. Otherwise, you can't drink water.
Yeah. Beautiful analogy. Well, hey, Mike, it's been a really fascinating conversation. I got one last question for you. I know you, in your new role, as you step out, you're taking more of a chairman role, mentoring a number of CEOs, and being more of an executive chairman. What shift will you need to make as you shift roles for you to multiply your impact in the coming years? What's going to be the biggest kind of stretch and biggest challenge for you personally?
I had this aha moment when about 12 years ago, when I first took on a non-exec board role. And the aha moment was that they don't have to listen to you as a non-exec. So, as a CEO, you got your list of this is what, you kind of know the mental model. This is what you got to do. But you always got to take the point of view that they don't have to listen to me. So, how do I use brevity to pick the things which are really going to matter to help the CEO? And B, how do I resist like just forcing the playbook? Because the playbook, needs to be owned by the CEO. And that requires, I think, a lot more people interaction skills. It requires a lot more kind of being conscious of this is something the CEO should do. So I'm going to step back. So often what I see in my role is I'm sometimes saying, the PE guys want to do something. I'll come say, no, you shouldn't do that. Let the CEO do it. Because I know that if the CEO does it, it's going to have a much stronger impact than if someone from the PE firm goes and does it. So it's that kind of dynamic of kind of being more sensitive to how do you make somebody else the champion and success, and said old Chinese saying of if they're successful, they're in the spotlight, they lead and I'll be in the background and kind of applauding their success.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, beautiful. It's a great analogy for moving from one role where you actually have all the strings to being in that role where you kind of look at the dynamics of the ecosystem at a new level and how you can pull those levers and influence. So beautiful. Well, Mike, thank you so much for a really fascinating conversation. We've covered hiring, we've covered self-doubt, we've covered PE CEOs and some of the playbook that you'd recommend for them. It's been a really rich conversation, sprinkled with liberal rugby metaphors, which is always good. So appreciate that. Appreciate our conversation, and look forward to following along in your next chapter.
Awesome. Thank you, Richard. It's great to chat.
Thank you, Mike. Goodbye. Well, that's a wrap. If you received value from this conversation, please do leave us a review on your favorite podcast platform. We deeply appreciate it. And if you'd like to check out the show notes from this episode, head to xquadrant.com/podcast, where you'll find all the details. Now, finally, when you're in top leadership, who supports and challenges you at a deep level to help you multiply your impact? Discover more about the different ways we can support you at xquadrant.com.